So now we are going to move into our keynote address. And I am going to introduce Chesa Boudin and his parents, Kathy and David. But before I do that, I want to explain a bit about how the next couple of minutes will work. After I introduce Chesa and Kathy and David, they will speak, and then there will be a brief Q&A at the end of the keynote address. If you have a question, you can do one of two things. You can either drop it in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand and the host will spotlight you and bring you onto the screen. Chesa Boudin was elected in November 2019 on a progressive platform centered on ending mass incarceration, police accountability, no cash bail, refusal to work with ICE, and addressing the root causes of crime. DA Boudin personally understands the impact of incarceration because both of his parents were incarcerated throughout his childhood. Prior to serving as district attorney, Chesa worked as an interpreter in Venezuela during the Hugo Chavez administration. Chesa was a Rhodes Scholar and graduated from Yale Law School. He worked as a law clerk on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and later on the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. Chesa then worked as a public defender in San Francisco, where he helped lead the office's bail reform unit. Some of Chesa's renowned policies include eliminating cash bail, ending racist sentencing enhancements, discouraging the police from using racist pretextual stops, and allowing victims of police violence to access victims as compensation. He also supports providing diversion opportunities for parents in the justice system, and ensuring that cases relying solely on the word of officers with documented serious misconduct are not prosecuted. And I must also say that Chesa is one of my heroes and someone that I have modeled my behavior as a progressive prosecutor after. And also our office has modeled most of our policies after those put in place by Chesa when he won in 2019. Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert are lifelong anti-imperialists whose actions in support of Black liberation resulted in decades in prison. Kathy spent 22 years behind bars. David, who was released in November of 2021, spent 40 years behind bars. David's lifetime of work against racism and for peace with justice began as a student when he joined the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE in 1962. As an undergraduate at Columbia in 1965, he started the Committee to End the War in Vietnam, one of the first groups to oppose the war in Southeast Asia. He was also a founding member of Columbia University, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and co-authored their iconic pamphlet naming imperialism as the system which the new movements needed to fight against, offering a strategic focus for the growing movement. David was also a founder of Men Against Sexism in Denver, Colorado, and a supporter of the women's liberation movement as firm, constructive efforts by women comrades showed him the importance of opposing sexism and of striving to live our humanist values in our personal relationships. In 1970, responding to the murderous government assault on the Black liberation movement and the massive bombings of Vietnam, David and Kathy went to undergrad to raise their level of resistance as part of the Weather Underground organization. By the end of the 1970s, after the WUO dissolved, David and Kathy worked more directly as allies of the Black liberation struggle and were captured in 1981. David remained active as a counselor and advocate for fellow prisoners throughout his decades behind bars. He contributed to the struggle through correspondence with younger generation activists and as a vocal political prisoner through his two books, Love and Struggle, My Life in SDS, The Weather Underground and Beyond, and No Surrender. He was one of the founders of the Certain Days Free Political Prisoners Calendar and continues on the advisory committee. David Gilbert remains a gentle and humble person. Even before Kathy Boudin's long history as an anti-war and Black liberation solidarity activist, she grew up in a family of committed radicals, including her NLG lawyer father, Leonard Boudin. She shared legal lessons that she learned at home with thousands after she joined Students for a Democratic Society and the mass protests against racism in the US war in Vietnam. Kathy co-wrote the classic activist pamphlet, The Bust Book, What to Do Till the Lawyer Comes, when many young people were protesting and facing arrest for the first time. She also joined the protest, refusing to accept the role of a complacent intellectual woman and instead confronting a system she knew to be oppressive to most of humanity. After years in the Weather Underground and her arrest in 1981, Kathy continued her political work at New York's maximum security prison for women in Bedford Hills. She found herself in the midst of the worst damage of the AIDS epidemic, before HIV had been identified as the source of the lethal condition that was ravaging incarcerated communities, or recognized as a disease that women were also contracting, and was a key organizer in building ACE, AIDS Counseling and Education. The work of ACE became a model for HIV and AIDS education in prisons across the country. With others, she authored Breaking the Walls of Silence, AIDS and Women in New York State Maximum Security Prison, about the fight to prevent deaths among incarcerated women and their families. She also joined other incarcerated women in writing and studying in 1999. Her poems were included in books and journals such as the Penn Center Prize Anthology, Doing Time, Concrete Garden, and Aliens at the Border. Also, while behind bars, Boudin published many articles and essays, including Participatory Literacy Education Behind Bars, AIDS Opens the Door. Kathy Boudin is one of 3 formerly incarcerated elders who in 2013 founded RAP, Release Aging People in Prison. RAP's work to end mass incarceration and promote racial justice through the release of prison elders and those serving long sentences has been one of the most effective prison non-reformist reform efforts. RAP works to dismantle the racist policies of mass incarceration by expanding the use of parole, compassionate release, clemency, and other forms of release in New York State, and to end life imprisonment in the US, and to organize community power to free incarcerated elders and uproot a system of endless punishment that damages Black and other communities of color. In every area of work, Kathy, like David, is deeply loved and valued. Her life is an example of how hard work, creativity, and perseverance in service of principle can itself be a lesson for future generations. I give to all of you, Chesa Boudin and his parents, Kathy and David.
But if you can hear us with no
We
echo,
can
that's
see
good.
and hear you at this point.
Okay, and I can't see you, but that doesn't really matter. We can just, David and I can just talk. But what about Chesa?
Chesa cannot be seen or heard yet.
I'm gonna send him a new link.
Okay.
Right
Okay,
now.
thank you so much, Verbena. All right, so Ms.
We were gonna go order of David Gilbert, then Kathy Boudin, and then Chesa Boudin. That was
Perfect. So then David can begin, and then Kathy, and by the time you all are done, hopefully Chesa will be all set. Thank you
Sounds
so
great.
much for your patience, everyone. I appreciate it, and thank you,
I don't even
Verbena.
know what I did, but it worked, so whatever.
Let's roll with it then.
Okay, that's good, that's great.
Okay, greetings to everyone at the dinner, and these technical issues are certainly a mystery to me after 40 years in prison, but it's great that we can get together. And I want to send my greetings to everyone there, and really pleased to be in the same program with the Guild and the honorees and the heroes. I want to send a special shout out to John Royal for his work with Chokwe Lumumba, who is definitely a hero in our legal confrontation with the state. And I might begin with how I first met the National Lawyers Guild, which was 1968. And I was on a peaceful demonstration against the war, and I was jumped by 3 cops who then charged me with assaulting them, of course. And court, well, what a scene the court was, Alice in Wonderland. But the National Lawyers Guild attorney who represented me was amazingly dignified and firm in standing up to the situation. Moving on to today, many in the United States have come to see the criminal legal system as dysfunctional. But those of us at this gathering know that that system, as the inheritor of first slavery and then Jim Crow, is effective in its primary goal, which is to keep oppressed communities in a state of chaos and agony. we know that the major sources of crime are the colossal crimes of poverty, racism, sexism, and unjust war. But there's also a lot that happens on the policy level. A biggest example is the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs. The architects and promoters of it knew about the violence and crime that would result because America had already experimented with prohibition earlier in the century. I just want to give a little, add a view from having spent time in prison. And in prison, it seems like the system couldn't be better designed to promote crime. The main lesson that they teach through practice, through the abusive searches, through the setups, through the beatdowns, through the violation of their own laws, is that might makes right. That's the lesson. But also many of the people I met and worked with who as adults got into such trouble with the criminal justice system had earlier experiences with it that were traumatizing. Juvenile detention, juvenile hall, just brutal, and had submitting to young people to that. Or early experiences being in jail, frequently on trivial or bogus reasons, and not being able to get out because they didn't have the money. Or themselves coming from families that were disrupted because parents had been incarcerated. All of these things are damaging and harmful to people and to the communities and families from which they come. Despite all this, there is a triumph of the human spirit. Most people in prison have grown to care about their families, their communities, and justice. A lot of that is from the mutual mentoring we did with each other and work that we did with each other. But it's so important that we resist, all of us resist passionately the punishment paradigm, and we fight to build healthier and stronger communities. And I really thank the National Lawyers Guild for the great work you do.
So I'm going to follow David and start by just saying we're very honored to be asked to be here tonight. And the Guild, National Lawyers Guild, definitely played a major role in my life. In so many ways, it was there for everybody, and that it really mattered. You know, when I left prison after 22 years, I left behind a lot of friends. One of my friends had been arrested when she was 17, and the judge gave her 50 to life, and that means 50 years. And the judge said he wishes he could have given her more. Other friends of mine were there because they had been selling drugs. Some people had been arrested for that. Some people had been arrested because their child died and they didn't get to the hospital in time, or they were abused and they ended up killing the person that was abusing them. People were there for all sorts of stories. But what came through in all the stories that I listened to in support groups was that people had experienced trauma. The women in their own lives had experienced a lot of abuse, violence, poverty, mental health issues, and they experienced the struggle to be mothers when they had trouble doing it because of all the things that they faced. Very often women in prison are kind of ignored because we're a small percentage of the people who are in prison. But the truth is that the women in prison have been portrayed in two main ways. One was as victims, and people are victims of all that they've experienced. You can summarize it in trauma, or you can summarize it with mental health issues. The other is women in prison are looked at as people who are bad, you know, man hater, crack addict, mother hater. And the in-between, women with agency, not just victims and not just bad people, is left out of the picture. My experience in prison was one in which I experienced the tremendous sense of agency, of desire to rebuild their lives, and a desire to make things change for themselves and for other people. And we had the experience in prison of creating over the 22 years and before I got there, a sense of community amongst us in believing that we could make a difference that would help each of us individually and help us as a community. And therefore, in areas of family violence, AIDS, being mothers, and bringing higher education back into the prison, all of these are areas in which we work together with committees, with trying to figure out how do we deal with it. We created an organization called ACE to care for each other as people were dying and to counsel each other before they went home and to train people as community leaders and activists who could go home and get jobs. And we taught classes as mothers to each other after we learned ourselves. How do you take care of an adolescent? What are the challenges that get faced? What about a newborn baby? And over again, this community of relationships got built around the work that we were doing to try to make a difference. And when people have gone home, and that's the situation I'm in now, many of these women are now doing amazing work. So the community that we built inside the prison has now been extended outside. We're building a building that's going to be a women's center. We're part of an international committee working with women around the world to share what the experiences have been as having been incarcerated. We're working on an oral history project about how it was that we mobilized ourselves in the prison, and as part of something called Women Transcending, as part of our Center for Justice. So I'm partly wanted to stress the fact that women in prison are neither just passive victims nor bad people, but are people with tremendous opportunity, potential, and given that opportunity, not only did we help each other, but we built programs that made a difference actually throughout the country. I think the thing that continues to haunt me was the divide between the concept of violent and nonviolent. The binary breakdown, starting with the idea that, people challenged the war on drugs, and that was really important to do that, but not good to define the people in prison who were there for drugs as people that were the good people, and the people that were there for violent crimes as the bad people. More than 50% of the people in prisons are there for a violent crime. And so if we dismiss those people in order to say, well, they're kind of the bad people in prison, we're dismissing 50% of the people in prison. And the truth is that people end up in prison because of the conditions that they face. And that's part of what being in prison was for me, was story after story after story of people's lives that led them into the prison. And so I think the fundamental policy of our son, Chesa, which says you can't incarcerate social problems. You have to address those social problems. And if you look at women in prison, they are there because of the problems that our society did not meet, whether it's mental health, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's abuse of the women, whether it's lack of education. And it's only by addressing those issues in the community that there's not going to be a reason to have women in prison, because really what they need is the support. And I'm happy just to be able to share a little bit of what my life was like in prison and what it continues to be like as I'm part of a large community. And I think in the bio, we talked a lot about RAP and release aging people in prison. And that's part of what our Center for Justice does, is to try to get legislation passed where people can get out before they serve their 50 years and are no longer alive. And we're hoping to get some laws passed that give people who are older the ability to go in front of the parole board after they've served 15 years and they're 55 and older. So decarceration, getting people out, getting older people out is part of the work that our Center for Justice does, and that I'm proud to be part of. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties, and I missed the beginning of my parents' presentation. But it's a real pleasure to be with all of you, and it's particularly delightful that I'm able to speak together with both of my parents, something that really never seemed, my entire life never seemed like would be a possibility. as you heard a little bit from my parents, when I was a baby, before I can even remember, they dropped me off with a babysitter and they went off to participate in an armed robbery. And even though neither one of them was armed, neither one of them directly hurt anybody, that day 3 men were killed, 2 police officers and a security guard. Obviously, my parents didn't come back to get me at the babysitter. I don't remember getting picked up by friends and family. I don't remember the judge sentencing my mom to 20 years to life or my father to 75 years to life. My earliest memories are waiting in lines at prison gates to be able to see my parents, to be able to give them a hug, just to be able to make eye contact with them. And way before I understood the politics of mass incarceration or the criminal legal system, I saw something on every one of those prison visits that stood out at me as a child. And it was the fact that as white prisoners, my parents were the outliers. I noticed immediately that the visitors were almost all Black and brown women and children. And over the years of visiting prisons, now decades I've spent visiting prisons, I came to see that it was a system that was working in a really perverse way. It was working to continue to tear families and communities apart. It was working in a way that ensured local governments were starved of resources to invest in building the kind of vibrant, safe, strong communities that we all want to raise our families in. It was building jails and prisons and hiring more prison guards instead of schools and teachers, instead of universities and city colleges. It was ensuring that an entire generation of Black and brown children grew up without fathers and women without partners. And it was doing it in ways that had nothing to do with healing or supporting or dignifying the suffering of crime victims and survivors, right? In other words, most victims of crime had nothing to show other than whatever hollow satisfaction retribution might offer. And so I went to law school many, many years later, still visiting my father in prison, still aware of this issue, but having researched and studied and lived problems firsthand. I went to law school with a commitment to end mass incarceration. So I joined the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. I fought individual cases, everything from petty theft and drunk driving all the way up to attempted murder, kidnapping. I handled all different kinds of cases. And what I saw, even in progressive San Francisco's courthouse, was the same kinds of everyday injustice that I had experienced as a child growing up visiting my parents in prison. Was the same dehumanization and stigma attached to everyone who's ever arrested, the same racial disparities, the same prioritization of police over people. And I worked on hundreds, if not thousands of cases. And it got frustrating because I realized that no matter what happened in the individual cases I litigated, no matter if I got a case dismissed or if a client successfully completed diversion, that they were going right back into the same system, a system that was set up to ensure they couldn't succeed, to use arrests and convictions and criminal records as barriers to jobs and housing and education, to ensure that people who needed mental health care and drug treatment wouldn't get it, and therefore, of course, would be right back in the same system, no matter what the outcome in a particular case. It was in that context that I decided to run for district attorney back in 2019. And I ran on an explicitly decarceral platform. My friend Tiffany Caban, I think has done a really good job clarifying what we mean when people talk about progressive prosecutors. Anybody can call themselves a progressive prosecutor. But what I'm about and what folks who are truly part of this movement are about is a recognition that we do more justice and build more safety when we find alternatives to incarceration wherever and whenever possible. And so as district attorney, I'm proud to tell you that I've reduced the number of kids in our juvenile jail by nearly 70%. And that I've reduced the number of adults in our jail by nearly 40%. And that I've reduced the number of people in our state prison out of San Francisco County by more than 25%. We are building access to diversion, to treatment, to counseling, to reentry housing. And we're doing it in ways that empowers judges and my staff and opposing counsel to find outcomes in cases that are not simply based in how much punishment we mete out. In other words, we're building a system of justice where we don't measure justice in pounds of flesh or years of incarceration, but rather through how many lives we can save, how many crimes we can prevent, how much we can dignify and honor the harm that so many people coming through our system have lived and carry with them. We're building a system in which we recognize that criminals and victims aren't opposite sides of a coin where one's white and one's black, as is so often the image presented in the nightly news, but rather a recognition that the people we prosecute in courtroom number 9 are victims in a case pending in courtroom number 10. A recognition that if we are serious, as I am, about building safer, stronger communities, then we can't simply wait for police to arrest people and expect that that's going to prevent future crime. Instead, we need to do things like we're doing in my office, where we sue the manufacturers of illegal firearms, where we sue gig economy corporations that are systematically stealing billions of dollars from their employees. We need to do things like invest in universal basic income for youth aging out of foster care, so they have a fair chance when they get started in life on their own. Those are the kinds of programs that we're sponsoring, the kind of legislation that we're driving, the kinds of litigation that we're emphasizing. And look, I want to be clear, we're prosecutors. We still are working with an imperfect system with imperfect tools. And there are some situations where we simply don't have good available alternatives. And so one of the things that I want to leave you with before we open up to questions is a challenge. And it's a challenge that I'll match with a commitment. The faster we collectively as a movement can build out alternatives to incarceration, the faster we can build out robust diversion programs and reentry housing, the faster we can find ways to make sure that young people have loving, supportive environments at home and access to jobs, the faster we can close more jails and prisons. My commitment is to continue to fight for decarceration just as fast as we build out those alternatives, so that when something terrible happens, when a violent crime occurs, or when a property crime occurs, we have an intervention that is human and humane, an intervention that is just and advancing justice. I know that amongst this group and all of the different networks that we are connected to, I know that there's a tremendous amount of energy and creativity and vision. And we must put that into positive alternatives. It is not enough in this day and age with folks like me in office, with folks like Kim Fox and Larry Krasner. And I know that none of us have gone as far as we would like to go. But we can no longer simply spend our energy pointing out the failings and the shortcomings of the criminal legal system. We must also begin doing the difficult work of building alternatives. The faster we do that, the faster we can close another jail and another prison and replace it with a university or with that apartment building or with a kindergarten. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chesa, Kathy, and David. If you all listen to Chesa and his parents, and you don't have a fire burning inside of you right now to fully step into your role in supporting the dismantling of the criminal punishment system in order to build an equitable, true justice system, I don't know what will set you on fire. Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And as you just heard Chesa speak and his parents, we have to do something different, radically different. And yes, we may be punished along the way. Yes, we may lose some and sacrifice our own freedoms along the way, but that is the work that must be done. it's not easy work. If it were easy, everyone would do it. And I invite all of you to ask questions of Chesa and Kathy and David while we still have them. If you want to know what you can do, what your role looks like as a lawyer, as a law student, as a legal worker, as an activist, as an organizer, it's imperative that whatever that role is, you find it in this moment. We cannot afford to wait. So with that, I'm opening it up to questions for any of you who have anything to ask of our dynamic speakers this afternoon. You have the floor.
There is a question in the question and answer, Victoria.
I see this. Abby has asked, do you find that the recall campaign, or being the DA seat in general, has forced you to change the messaging of or stray from some of your radical views in the short term to achieve longer term justice?
It's a great question. And, this is one of the challenges in any context of electoral politics, is that, you can win a narrow victory. My election in 2019 was a really close race. I ended up winning by about 1% over my nearest competitor in a four-way race. And I took office knowing that while I had been concrete and detailed and specific about the policies I was going to implement and about the changes I was going to make, that there was a significant percentage of the city that had preferred a much more traditional conservative candidate. And so I set about trying, way before the recall started or gained momentum or qualified for the ballot, I set about trying to govern for all of San Francisco, not just for the people who had voted for me. And the challenge, of course, is that there's tremendous misunderstanding, not coincidental, not accidental, tremendous misunderstanding of what actually happens day in, day out in the criminal legal system. And so I'll just tell you one story, just to give you one example. I was leaving an event at San Francisco State not long ago, speaking to students. Actually was on a panel where I was privileged to speak alongside Angela Davis. And I'm walking out of the event and somebody recognizes me on the street. And they say, aren't you the DA? And I said, yes, sir, I am. Who are you? How can I help you? And he says, when are you going to start doing your job? When are you going to start arresting people? And I said to him, sir, I am not going to start arresting people ever. And he was like, I knew it. You won't do your job. And I said, no, sir, that's not my job. DAs, we don't make arrests. That's not what we do. And it's just one example. I could give you dozens more of the ways in which people think that or act as though it's supposed to be my job as district attorney to fly in with a Batman cape and arrest the bad guys, right? Even if we buy into their narrow, simplistic black and white universe where there's good guys and bad guys, that is simply not what we do. And so to your question, it's been less about, changing values or principles and much more about figuring out ways to try and communicate effectively and do, while I'm governing, while we're trying to drive system change, also do the work of finding ways to communicate to people and meet them where they're at, even when they're at places that are really disconnected from data and evidence and the structures in our system.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Willow. Please discuss the Spirit of Mandela International Tribunal and upcoming People's Senate. And is that a question for David and Kathy, Willow?
Well, the Spirit of Mandela is in the tradition of the historic appeals to the United Nations. We charge genocide, of the genocide towards African Americans, or also Native Americans and people of color. And it's to raise a human rights banner internationally in terms of the political prisoners that still exist in prisons in the US, and to build international solidarity. I'm not yet involved in the details and specifics, so I can't be more helpful than that. There might be people there who are. Jaleel Muntakim, who's a released Black Panther and ex-BLA political prisoner, has been a moving force in it. But there's a strong history of appealing internationally to expose the genocide in the United States and the incarceration of political prisoners, and to build international solidarity.
I would say that building international solidarity is been more difficult in this period than in the 60s, when around the world there were national liberation struggles happening that represented a certain kind of hope and possible models for the future. And now in the work that I do, the women that I work with, the sense of internationalism is simply not present in particular. I think that Angela Davis has certainly contributed around the issues of Palestine, which, have made a difference. But I think international solidarity, both in terms of what it means for us and our political prisoners and people in prison in general, and also what it has to do with us being in solidarity with people around the world that are struggling. So I think it's a really, international solidarity is a really important thing.
Thank you both. Chesa, the next question is for you. One of my very good friends and former colleagues, well, she's always going to be my colleague. You don't stop being a criminal defense attorney. It's just like in your heart forever. She wants to know what your biggest struggle has been in being the district attorney.
There's a lot. I mean, look, we inherited on day one a system that, as I think somebody in the chat said, is not a broken system. It's a system that was designed to work a particular way. And, you go from being an outsider with a clear vision of critique about this system and how it's failing us, how it's failing to rehabilitate, failing to deter or prevent crime, failing to heal survivors of crime. And all of a sudden you own it. And anything that goes wrong from the standpoint of the values that we have, or from the standpoint of public safety more broadly, they're going to blame us for it. And they're going to do that in ways that they would never do with a traditional tough on crime, lock them up and throw away the key style prosecutor, right? So I was at an event the other day celebrating a nonprofit that does amazing work with our youth. And I posted a photo on Instagram saying that I was honored to be there to celebrate this organization. And all of a sudden, people are commenting saying, well, there was just a robbery on the other side of the city. What are you doing celebrating? Again, as though because there's a crime in a big city somewhere, we can't be doing other parts of our job. And they would never do that to Anne Marie Schubert, the DA in Sacramento, or Nancy O'Malley, the DA in Oakland, places that have much higher per capita violent crime rates than San Francisco, that have seen crime go up far more than it's gone up in my jurisdiction. So I think the short answer to your question is the hardest part is that the system is so inhuman and so set up to ensure that people, especially poor people and people of color, are held down, that trying to take that system and, you think about how long it took to build, right? I mean, if you've read books like, Christian Parenti, Lockdown America, or if you've read Michelle Alexander, Angela Davis, I mean, the system that we inherited took decades of massive investment and very intentional, explicit policymaking to build up. And whether they're our allies in our base or our detractors, the expectation is that we're going to solve all those problems overnight. And that's just not real. It's going to take time. And so being patient, even as I feel a intense sense of urgency in the work we do, is the hardest part.
Thanks, Chesa. The next question is from Sarah, and it's for David and Kathy. As a musician, singer, songwriter, and an activist, any wisdom you can instill towards me and people like me regarding music and it being a tool for liberation?
I mean, I just feel like the music, the dance, it's so important in terms of people being able to survive the oppression, survive the really difficult conditions. And I think that my only suggestion is that it keep up, that more happens. And certainly there are efforts to get into the prison with cultural events. One of the people who I mentioned before, she was sentenced to 50 to life when she was 17. She was able to get a case reversed 2 years ago, partly because she was only 17 when she got sentenced, and the issue of age matters. And she got out 2 years ago before her 50 years were up. And she's helped to create a group, a writing group called Right to Heal of her name is Roz. And it's right, and she's created it with Cheryl, and it's the Right to Heal. And it's RIGHT and RWRITE to heal. And it's a writing group of women in prison writing poetry, women out of prison writing poetry, and women from not just New York, but also Maine. And we're looking at a national process. So poetry, that's a cultural, music, cultural, dance, cultural. And I just encourage those of you who are artists to understand how important it is for the survival of people facing really terrible conditions.
Thank you. Our last question for the evening comes from Josh, and it's for all three of you. Kathy, David, and Chesa, is there any legal optimism related to still imprisoned political prisoners, namely Mutulu, Sundiata, and Varanza?
And we can add to that list of political prisoners who are elder and who have serious health issues, like Leonard Peltier and Kamal. I think you mentioned Sundiata.
Yeah.
Listen, my getting out was almost a miracle. And it took years of very persistent hard work. And it was on the wings of a movement, both around political prisoners and mass incarceration. I was very fortunate. But miracles like that do happen if people are persistent, if people are creative, if people are loving, and if people are very clear on the message. So I don't have exactly a blueprint or a formula, but yes, there's hope for those prisoners. And they do have campaigns. And I would really encourage people not to give up, but to always put new energy and new ideas and bring new people into those efforts.
One of my close friends spent some time in prison and then worked for 15 years to get her husband out. And whenever we're together at a conference, she always gets on the stage and she says, when we fight, we win. And I would say that it's a really important thing to maintain that hope and that belief and that spirit.
Optimism is the lifeblood of everything all of us do as activists, as organizers, as litigators. You have to have hope. You can't get out of bed in the morning. You literally can't leave your house if you don't have something to look forward to, if you don't have some belief in the possibility for change and for achieving what we set out to do. Doesn't mean that the odds aren't steep. It doesn't mean that the road isn't long and difficult. It is. But we also know that the things that are worth fighting for are the things that matter most, right? And, you know, I spent my whole life thinking that my father would die in prison, thinking that that was an almost certainty, but it was an almost certainty. And that little sliver of hope, that little glimmer of light that made us think maybe there was just maybe a path is what not only gave him the energy and the confidence and the strength to make it through 14,615 days in a cage, but also gave my mother and myself and a tremendous network of friends and family and allies and supporters and advocates a reason to keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing, and finally to make the governor do something that probably he didn't want to do, and then finally make the parole board do something that they probably didn't really want to do. if we hadn't seen that light at the end of the tunnel, if we hadn't held on to that hope, however unrealistic it might have been, then he wouldn't be on this Zoom call today.
Thank you. Thank you. I cannot express enough gratitude. I'm sorry, were you trying to say something, Mrs. Boudin?
No, no, I just heard the echo come back. So I was like, oh my God.
I heard it a little bit too.
It might be my son upstairs making noise. I've got a 6-month-old. You can blame his grandparents for his rambunctiousness. He must get it from them.
Okay.
That's called good trouble, Chesa, and stop
They said
letting
he's
that
making
baby.
all kinds of noise upstairs right now.
We welcome babies in this space. As many of you heard early on, my 4-year-old oftentimes makes appearances, which is why I had to come to my office tonight for this dinner. Thank you all so much. So honored to have all 3 of you on screen with us. And it was a real treat to have you all together to enlighten us and to encourage us. Chesa, just as a personal note, you have carried me many days and you didn't know it, because what you've described, we experience in Washtenaw County as a progressive prosecutor's office. And we look to you to show us that we can keep going. The days are long and hard. The criticism is tough, but it will not break us. So thank you for being a shining example of what it means to get inside of a system, to break it down to nothing, to rebuild it in an equitable and just way to serve all people. It really means a lot. And best of luck to you. Right
We
on.
got this.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Great to speak with you. Thank you for the work, for the energy, for the inspiration. Onwards and upwards.
Onwards and upwards.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're very happy to be here today, as you can imagine.
Thank you, David and Kathy. The years that you spent in a cage and continued your fight from inside, it's remarkable. Many have not been able to do that. Many have not been able to come home. But
Right.
you did, and you are still fighting to bring home our brothers and sisters inside. And you continue to teach us and guide us. And that means more than we could ever express here tonight. So thank you.